So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter for today. Our presenter today is Dr. Laurie Friedman. Dr. Friedman is an assistant professor of instruction and the online MSW coordinator in the School of Social Work within Temple University's College of Public Health. She earned her PhD in social work at the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research at Bryn Mawr College. She completed her master's degree in social work at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, and her master's degree in public administration at the Fels Institute of Government at the University of Pennsylvania as well. So Dr. Friedman is a licensed clinical social worker in Pennsylvania with over a decade of direct and administrative social work practice, experience with children, youth, and families in a number of settings. Her particular areas of interest are children in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. She's been trained in multi-systemic therapy, MST, and focused her dissertation research on better understanding how potential foster parents experience the licensing process. Dr. Friedman is also interested in the areas of teaching and learning, both in virtual and in-person spaces, as is evidenced by today's webinar. She's experienced with the idea of teaching virtually. She holds a teaching certificate from Bryn Mawr College in addition to Quality Matters Teaching Online Certificate. She has presented at several teaching-focused conferences as well. So she's definitely experienced with the idea of teaching, and we're definitely honored to have her on our call today. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks so much. And so I'm going to turn on the webcam. I'm really excited to be with you all today and share a little bit about social workers' involvement in the electoral process. I also just wanted to add in terms of why I'm here today. I'm also a member of NASW's PACE committee, so our political action committee, and so really looking at what our role is as social workers. So given all that about online teaching, you all have access to the handouts, and there is much more information on these PowerPoint slides than I would ever have in a class, but really hoping that today that you leave here by 1 o'clock with some really concrete and tangible resources to use that are applicable to your area of practice. Given that we are 2 weeks away from some crucial midterm elections, we're really focusing today on how we can participate in local, state, and federal elections and looking at our ethical obligation to do that. And so as Tyler said, I'll do my best to answer questions as we go along, but I'll also save time at the end. So I thought I'd share with a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. And so she says that where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And so thinking about this quote and thinking about civic engagements, it's something that invokes a sense of community, local action, and this idea that small actions matter. I think a lot of us, we look at the news, which really is skewed and focuses on national events, and we forget the importance of what's happening right in our communities and the positive effects that we can have. So just to get us started, we talk about civic engagement a lot and to make sure we're all on the same page, but just kind of separating the two terms out. So civic pertains to the public arena, connoting public benefit, and looking at engagement as something that connotes action. So in this case, it aims to affect the care or development of others and influence public decision-making and resource distribution. So civic really harkens back to the Greeks, and looking at how city-states were organized around the vote and the contribution of independent citizens. And so looking at how we separate civic engagement, we can separate it into two spheres of influence. And so one looking at the social sphere and one looking at the political sphere. But civic engagement holistically includes our knowledge, our skills, our attitudes, and our behaviors. And I think it's important, especially as we think about this webinar today, looking at how knowledge, skills, and attitudes are prerequisites of behavior. So we can't actually act on anything if we don't have the skills to do so, the attitudes and the knowledge. And so I think that our code of ethics in terms of why we're here today grounds us in terms of the attitude, and that we have an ethical obligation to participate in social action. Our training gives us a specific skills, and hopefully you'll leave today with some more specific knowledge to add to existing ones. And then we're going to focus on the political sphere and not the social one, just given time constraints. So just in terms of a little bit of context, here's a chart, and this is from the Civil Deserts America Civic Health Challenge. It's from 2017. And we can look at nationally how Americans are engaged in their communities. The darker blue are your people who are most active. The lighter blue are people who are members, but they're not active members. And then the grayish one is people who are not a member. And we can see how that's divided up between religious congregations, other face-to-face group, the increasing role of online communities, humanitarian and service groups, and going down the line. Political parties are about in the middle there. And some quick facts about Pennsylvania. And so looking at Pennsylvania, we are below the national average in terms of people who volunteer. And we are also we are above the national average in terms of people who report that they work with neighbors to fix or improve communities. We're below the average in terms of those of us who attend public meetings. And we are just below, at 40%, the national average of people who voted in the 2014 midterm election. And so looking at how voter turnout is often lower in the midterms and even lower in local and state elections that don't fall on a midterm or a presidential election. 14% of us do report that we do favors for neighbors, and 56% of people in Pennsylvania report that we sometimes vote in those local elections. But look at that last number here. Less than 10% of people in Pennsylvania have contacted or visited a public official. So when I think of these numbers and what they mean, I think that the biggest takeaway is that there is a disproportionate minority of people in Pennsylvania who are influencing our government. So there's less than 50% of people who are voting to have a say in who our leaders are, and then less than 10% of us who are following up in terms of what they're doing and developing relationships with our elected officials. And so looking at who they listen to and who has an influence and what we can do in those arenas, I think what that tells me is that there's actually quite a lot of room for influence if we're one of those, if we fall into that 10%. So we're not competing with all of Pennsylvania to have influence, we're just competing with a small percentage. Here's our voting turnout rate. This is national by age, population, and race and ethnicity. We can look here at how non-Hispanic whites are more likely to vote. And then the second slide here is turnout by age. And so we know that older Americans are more likely to vote than younger Americans. And you can see the up and down, how that changes from presidential year to midterms. And so again, voter turnout being higher in presidential years. And then voting turnout by education. And so again, people who have postgraduate degrees are much more likely to vote than people who have less than a high school diploma. So when I think of our code of ethics and I think about the people that we're called to work with, looking to serve people who are oppressed, who are underprivileged, this tells me that we have a role to play to make sure that they have a voice at the table. And so hopefully again today giving us some concrete skills to do that. In terms of the importance of civic engagement, there are actually a lot of benefits to it. And so human development, we can look at cognitive and social development. And so civic engagement is actually a prime example of how we interact between our cognitive and social selves, right? And so looking at how do we examine issues that are interesting to us and how does that help us to develop? We are influenced by our what we're exposed to socially, our families and our schools. And so looking at how do we fit that in with that cognitive development as we get older. We've talked a little bit, but protecting democracy. And so citizen engagement, going back to the Greeks, really depends on citizen engagement. And there are so many opportunities to do that, again, given time constraints, focusing today on voting. Self-care, just a sneak peek, but civic engagement is a practice of self-care. It's something we can do to help us cope and to help people we work with cope as well. It also helps us develop our skills and confidence. And so people who participate in civil society, such as volunteering, we develop skills and habits that actually make us more employable and strengthen our networks to find jobs. And so there's a statistic, that volunteers have a 27% higher likelihood of finding a job after being out of work than non-volunteers. And that increases to 51% for those people who don't have a high school diploma. And so there's some skills, some confidence, and networking that happens when we're civically engaged. I can definitely speak to that with my own experience in terms of the people I've met and the opportunities I've had, because it forces me to go outside of my social circle, which is disproportionately filled with social workers. And so I have met a lot of people in different fields the past couple years through civic engagement. And then social justice. One of my favorite quotes is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And looking at the history of social work, look at the importance of group work, community organizing, the role that agencies and organizations play, and definitely if we're looking towards social change, we need to do that as a group. So I just want to shift a little bit and speak quickly about that connection between social work ethics and civic responsibility. You do have access to these slides, and hopefully we're familiar with our code of ethics, but it's ingrained in the code of ethics. And we have the primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. And so looking at, again, who shows up to vote, these groups of people are severely underrepresented, and there's actually, I think, a misnomer, I know at least for me, I can't speak for all of you, in terms of the legal and ethical role that nonprofit agencies can play in elections. All right, the Code of Ethics also talks about how we have an ethical responsibility in different domains, and I've highlighted here our ethical responsibilities in practice settings, and to the social work profession, and to broader society, because there are roles that we can play in these settings specifically in regards to elections. And then more specifically, in case you're not convinced, I've just pulled out some quotes from section 5 and 6 of our Code of Ethics. And that second bullet point here, social workers should facilitate informed participation by the public in shaping social policies and institutions. And so I asked my 7-year-old daughter this morning why it's important to vote. And sometimes I think we overcomplicate things. Her answer was, "Well, Mommy, otherwise we don't have good leaders." Now, oftentimes it's which is the better choice, or at least worst choice, but looking at that role in terms of who's going to shape our social policies and institutions, and making sure that we have a role, we have a seat at the table. So fun fact, did you know? So Jeannette Rankin was a social worker, and she was the first woman to hold federal office in the US. She was actually elected to the House of Representatives from Montana in 1916. She was a pacifist. She voted against World War I, got a lot of flack for it, was not reelected. She was again elected in 1940, voted against World War II, was not reelected. But I think for me, look at that civic engagement and political participation in the political sphere is that it's embedded in the backbone of who we are as a profession, again, in our ethical code. It's not just Jeannette Rankin. And so there are many, many more examples. And so looking at just a few here. So we've got Jane Addams, we've got Ida B. Wells, looking at some current ones. So our senator, there's Barbara Molesky and Debbie Stabenow from Michigan. Barbara Molesky just recently retired from Maryland. But the role of social work is in shaping our legislative agenda. One thing, I think it's Debbie Stabenow, one of the quotes that I like, she says that basically, in her view, it's more important and a better use of our time to spend our time electing the right people to be in office, rather than spending our time trying to convince the wrong people in office to do what we think is right. And so looking at the sphere of political involvement. And just to sum up a little bit of this, and so here are our core 6 values of social work, and looking at how they converge in terms of how we have a responsibility to participate. All right. So what skills do we bring? I mentioned earlier that skills, knowledge, and attitudes are a key tenet of a prerequisite for involvement in the civic sphere. And so just a few, we are qualified, right? And so we value and embrace diversity. We're able to develop relationships. I have found time and time again in my own personal career and looking at the students I work with, the agencies I work with, that importance of human relationships. That's where all change happens, whether it be on the clinical level, the meso level, or the macro level. We have skills in active listening. Those aren't just counseling skills. Those are really important when we're having community meetings, when we're having task group meetings, when we're talking to our elected officials, we're talking to constituents, and those active listening skills get us really far. We have skills in group work, skills in community organizing, and skills in program evaluation. So these are just a few to get us started here. But hopefully I don't have to convince you that we do have the skills and we deserve to have a seat at the table. All right, so opportunities to participate in the political sphere. So let's get to the nitty-gritty here with a focus on voting. A reminder that, excuse me, the political sphere consists of legislative, electoral, or the judicial process, such as voting and advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. So, a couple more quotes. We have more possibilities available in each moment than we realize. And so being aware of those, I think a lot of times we don't know where to start to get information. And then once we kind of get in, it's like it's a floodgates open and we realize, oh my gosh, there's so many ways to get involved than I thought. And then Lily Tomlin says that she always wondered why somebody doesn't do something about that and then realize I was a somebody. So did you know? In case you're not aware, voting access is actually restricted. There has been a stronger plethora of voter ID laws. There's been purging of voter rolls, and there's been intimidation by political parties. However, we do know that voting leads to better outcomes. And so individuals and communities that vote report better health, employment, and other important outcomes. They receive more resources from elected officials and develop stronger community connections. Excuse me, voting builds power. It maximizes the capacity to influence public policy and can also offset some of the negative effects of oppression and discrimination. If you're not aware, and I put the source there, and there's some more resources at the end, voting is social work. There's been this movement to give us resources for social workers, and this is taken directly from the research they've done. Really helpful resource that I would encourage you all to look at. And so in terms of voter ID laws and how those have changed. So in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key tenet of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so what happened was that there were 9 states that, mostly in the South, who had a history of discrimination. And before they had any change in their voter ID laws, they had to have advanced federal approval. Ever since 2013, that no longer is the case, and we've seen an increase in restrictive voter ID laws since that. And so if you want to look at specific changes, I put a hyperlink in there in terms of nationally. You can see the voting laws that have been implemented since 2013. And so again, that voting is social work. By supporting people to vote, so we as social workers can improve individual well-being at the micro level. We can strengthen organizations and communities at the meso level. We can influence government decision-making. And we also can secure policies that promote social justice, so looking at the macro level, and we can help overcome voter suppression. So a little bit of the lay of the land. Nonpartisan voter registration, education, outreach are legal, ethical, and professional. And so the federal tax code contains one sentence that defines the prohibition of partisan political activities by a 501c3 charitable organization. It states that 501c3 organizations are, quote, prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. So whether activities are considered partisan political activity really depends on the facts and circumstances of each situation. But what's really clear from this code is that there's still a lot that 501c3s can do on a nonpartisan basis to promote voter and civic engagement as part of our charitable and educational mission during the election season. So specifically, and this is directly again from the Voting is Social Work website, here are 10 ways that agencies can make a difference. And again, completely nonpartisan. We can ask our clients if they're registered to vote during intake or during check-in. And that can be, we're all familiar with a lot of paperwork that our agencies give us. This can be one of them. Is there a voter registration form? If we know someone's moved recently, do we give them that information in terms of how to update their registration? We can also help them. We can help register them online or via the form. We can also help them check their voter registration status at their current address and voter ID requirements in their state, as well as felony voting rights, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And that, again, nonpartisan, but we can help give them that information. We can also help clients sign up for text and email reminders to vote. There's so many apps out there, and so we can do that as well. We can help our clients look up who represents them and make sure that they have the information to contact their elected officials. We can also invite elected officials to our agency and encourage clients to attend candidate forums. These are their representatives, and many representatives are looking to engage with their constituents. And so we can do that so they can hear directly from the people we work with, what issues they care about and what struggles they're facing in their lives. We can also reach out to local partners for candidate guides and resources. And so a lot of the newspaper does, and I have some at the end. The Committee of 70 in Philadelphia does it. Ballot Ready is a national one, but we can reach out for candidate guides and resources and give that to our clients and those that we work with, so they can make informed decisions as to who they want to vote for. We look at research as to why people don't come out to vote. One of the things that comes out is that they don't know anything about the candidates, right? And we can bridge that gap, that information gap. We can get copies of the ballot at our town clerk's office before the election, so people are aware of that. We can remind and encourage people to vote. We can put a sign up, and many people who don't vote report it's because they've never been asked, right? So we can have a sign up, we can have a reminder, a newsletter that goes out on our website, on social media. These are all things that don't cost any money, don't take a lot of time, but it gets the message out that their voice matters and they have a say in our government. And we can create a culture of voting in our agency and in our community as well. Looking at how do we celebrate it, how do we talk about it, if we're supervisors at agencies, do we give people an hour off election day to go vote, comp their time, what do those policies look like? All right. So who can vote in Pennsylvania? All voters in Pennsylvania must be U.S. citizens. They have to be at least 18 years old on election day, and they have to have been a resident of Pennsylvania for at least 30 days before the election. Anyone who's on probation or on parole is eligible to vote. The following populations, and this is different from state to state when we look at people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, so this is specific to Pennsylvania. The following people are eligible to vote, but they have to use an absentee ballot, and I'll talk a little bit about absentee ballots later on. People who are in jail or prison and have been convicted of misdemeanors, they can vote using the absentee ballot. People are under house arrest, they can vote. They can't leave the house, but they need to use an absentee ballot. People who are on parole or probation and living in halfway houses or community correction centers, so they can vote. They have to use an absentee ballot, but they cannot use the address of the halfway house as a registration address. And so their permanent address needs to be their previous or future address. And then people who are being held in jail, whether awaiting to go to trial, can vote. They have to use an absentee ballot. And so looking at oftentimes who are these people interfacing with, it's social workers, right? And how do we give them this information? Who cannot vote in Pennsylvania? So people who are in prison or in jail because of a felony conviction and who won't be released before the election cannot vote. And people who've been convicted of violating Pennsylvania election laws within the past 4 years. There is a great handout, it's on the same page, but the ACLU of Pennsylvania has a great handout, a one-pager that has this all really accessible format. And even passing that out to people we work with and friends and families can be really helpful. Special population. So here's I consider our bread and butter as social worker. So looking at residents of nursing homes, assisted living facilities, or psychiatric institutions. And so it's important here, they have a right to vote, and it looks different in different localities. And so it's really important you talk to your register of voters. So some facilities have requested and made efforts to get their local precinct moved there. And they do that through contact with the local Bureau of Elections. If it's a short-term facility, oftentimes residents don't change their voter registration address, and so they're registered to vote at their permanent address, and we can help them use an absentee ballot for that. The other piece is if they're in a long-term care facility, oftentimes people forget to change their voting address, so we can help them with that because they're not thinking of driver's licenses, so they're not changing it. But staff at these facilities need to help residents remember to change their registration or request absentee ballots. And again, that looks different from each locality, and there's some information for you as well. Victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or risk of injury to a minor. So there is an address confidentiality program. There's a link there for more information, but they can vote if they don't want to share the address of where they're living. Excuse me, and they can use an absentee ballot or other means of voting, and that's specific again to your locality. People who are homeless have a right to vote. They can use their shelter's address, a street corner, or a park, and they'll vote in that district. And that's really important, I think, to look at that population. College students have two choices when they vote. They can vote via absentee ballot to use their permanent home address, or they can register to vote at their campus or local address. They can't do both, but they can pick or choose which one they want to do. All right, I promised we would talk about absentee ballots. And so permanent absentee ballots are available for those with disabilities who are unable to appear at the polls in person. And there's, I put a link at the bottom, but there's a form that can be filled out that shows that this person will permanently receive an absentee ballot. And all you have to do is submit an application accompanied by a note from the voter's physician that states that they're unable to appear in person at the polls. And emergencies happen, right? And so sometimes we think we're going to be able to vote on election day, and circumstances change. We have a medical emergency, or we receive notice that we're going to be absent from our municipality for the election, right? So for this year, if your circumstances for election day change, you may apply for an emergency ballot up to 5 p.m. On November 2nd. The application must be notarized prior to making that application, and it must be received in the Bureau of Elections at 5 p.m. on November 2nd. The election's November 6th. So you get sick, so you become physically disabled or ill between the 5 p.m. on the Friday before election day and 8 p.m. On election day, or you find out that you're going to be absent. So looking at this emergency absentee ballot via the Court of Common Pleas, and again, the application is available on the Bureau of Elections website. You can designate in writing a representative to deliver your absentee ballot for you and return your completed ballot to the Bureau of Elections. It has to be received by 8 p.m. on November 6th. So people who work in hospitals are probably the ones who are most likely going to encounter this. All right. Moving forward, your voting rights and the law. And so there are some rights that we have that we need to be aware of. Our right to vote can only be challenged if a if a poll worker, a poll watcher, or an other voter says we don't live in the precinct, or they don't think we are, or they say we're not who we say we are. It is illegal for any person or corporation to intimidate or coerce you to vote for or against a particular candidate or a political issue. You also have the right to assistance if you cannot read or write, if you cannot read the names on the ballot, if you have difficulty understanding English, or if you're blind, disabled, or unable to operate the voting machines. We can request help from a relative, a friend, a neighbor, or another voter. And I think that's really important, thinking of the people that we often work with. We can ask for help, and that person does not have to be designated in the poll book as someone who has assistance permitted. What happens is you walk in to vote, you ask for assistance, and you just sign an assistance declaration. You also have the right to refuse assistance if someone's offering it to you. And so I think about not just physical, but looking at mental health disabilities and issues. And so people who have social anxiety, it can be really helpful to have someone coming with you and keeping you company as you vote. Under the American Disabilities Act, if a voter has difficulty standing, they can ask to move to the front of the line or for a chair. And if a voter is visually impaired, there is an accommodation, usually via phone, at every single polling place. So a lot of what I had talked about, the deadline to register to vote in Pennsylvania has passed. And so it's good information, I think, to have in the future. But there's October 30th. That's our last day to apply for civilian absentee ballots, so people who are not serving in the military. And we can do that now. We don't have to wait until October 30th. In fact, I would encourage you not to. You can print out absentee ballots and have them at your agency. November 2nd is the last day for the County Board of Elections to receive voted civilian absentee ballots, unless you're following that emergency process that I just mentioned. And then November 6th is our general election. So who to vote for? Again, we cannot tell people who to vote for, but we can give them resources so they can determine for themselves. Ballot Ready, it's a free website. I think they have an app. I'm not entirely sure on that, but it's so easy to use. You put in your address, and it tells you who's going to be on the ballot. And then there are you click on the different candidates, and when you choose who you want to vote, you can mark who you're going to vote for after you read about them, and then you can choose to print it out. So you can actually go to your voting place with a printed ballot, having researched the candidates. You don't have to take any notes, but you've done the research, and you know who you're voting for. NASW Pennsylvania, our political action committee, does endorse some candidates. And for Pennsylvania, we endorse state candidates, and the national NASW endorses in national races. And there's a link there. It's also on the NASW Pennsylvania website in terms of who has been endorsed. Philly.com just published a Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware voter guide, again giving information on candidates for different offices. And then Penn Live carries a link as well in terms of a more statewide general election voters guide. And this is just a tip of the iceberg because there are so many resources out there. All right. On election day, we've done all the preparation. So polls open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you are in line, when the polls close, you are entitled to vote. So those doors do not close until the line ends. In Pennsylvania, the only time that you need ID is if it's your first time voting at that location. So if you have moved, this is your first time at a new location, you will need to bring your ID. In Pennsylvania, acceptable ID includes both a photo and a non-photo ID, so you can pick or choose which one. But do note that an ID that does not have your photo has to have your address on it. So examples, a driver's license, a U.S. passport, a military student or employee ID, a voter registration card, a firearm permit, a current utility bill, bank statement, paycheck, or government check, or any ID issued by the Commonwealth or federal government. Uber and Lyft are offering free rides. I included a hyperlink here with some information on that. And so looking, oftentimes I think inclement weather can be an impediment to voter turnout. I know oftentimes people who have young kids, walking a couple blocks can be difficult. So free rides are being offered. And things that we can do. We can encourage others to vote. We can offer rides to our friends, our neighbors, our family members, and we can share information via social media. And please feel free to share anything that you learned today. A couple questions that sometimes happen. What happens if you go to vote and your name's not in the poll book? And the local officials at your poll should call the County Board of Elections to determine if you are indeed registered. If you are, they should allow you to vote normally. If they tell you you're registered to vote, but you're at the wrong precinct, the wrong voting location, you can go to the correct precinct. If they can't find your name and you think you are registered to vote, but your name was omitted from the poll book, you can vote using a provisional ballot. And a provisional ballot is a paper ballot which should be provided to you when you believe you're registered and your names are not on the rolls. Or if you are a first-time voter and you don't have ID, you can vote using a provisional ballot. More on election day. So this is how things should work, but they don't always work, right? And so thankfully we have a lot of organizations that are working to ensure that our right to vote is protected. And so the Pennsylvania Election Protection Coalition is coordinated by the ACLU of Pennsylvania, Common Cause Pennsylvania, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania Voice. And so here are some helpful phone numbers that you can print out, you can give to your clients, your coworkers, your family members, in terms of if they encounter any kind of difficulty on election day, they have questions on how to obtain an absentee ballot. These are numbers they can call. They are toll free. There's a number for English, for Spanish, and for a variety of Asian languages. And here's a list of things that they can help with. Questions about polling locations and registration status, improper challenges at the polls, if you feel like you're being intimidated, polling places that aren't open when they should be or have very long lines, or poll workers that are improperly asking for photo ID from voters after the election. And so again, looking at our civic engagement responsibilities, we don't just want to vote for people, we want to make sure they do what they said they were going to do once they're in office, and we can hold them accountable. There are, again, many apps. Some of the ones that I have found useful is VoteSpotter. Again, it's free. You put in your name and your address, and you just get alerts on your phone whenever your elected official votes for something. So you don't have to sign up for an email or look it up, and you can read that specific legislation. If you're not sure where your legislators are, there's a link to look them up. And I really find Google Alerts helpful. We are inundated with so much news and so many resources out there. How do we take control of it? And I don't know about you all, but time is a precious resource. So I put in my elected officials into Google. It says all free. I set up an alert, and I can set it up for either daily or weekly summaries, and it will peruse all the news sources in the country, and I will get an email whenever their name comes up and they were listed. And so if they had a town hall, someone wrote an op-ed, I can read the articles and keep track of what my elected officials are doing. This is especially important when we're looking at the local and state level, because there's just less news coverage on that. I also find it really helpful because it helps me, I work at Temple, I'm outside of Philadelphia, but to find out what's being said in other parts of the state, because I don't read the local newspapers outside of Philly on a regular basis, so those Google Alerts become really helpful. All right, wrapping up. So we've talked about how social work ethics and civic engagement are connected and the benefits of civic engagement. And so hopefully we come here with this attitude that we do have a responsibility to participate in the political sphere. We've also identified some opportunities and arenas to engage in and the skills that we bring specifically. So I think the question is, what do we do with this information? So barriers, right? Why don't many of us do this? I mentioned earlier, my daughter thinks that if we vote, we'll get good leaders, but sometimes it is a choice between who's the least worst, and that can be a detriment to voting if we're not voting affirmatively or positively for a particular candidate. I don't know about you all, but I've heard politics is dirty. Our government's broken. I don't even know where to start. I'm already underpaid, so my work is like volunteering. However, we're also inundated with the news, and this is taken from about a month or so, but watching the news and staying informed can be really draining because it's not really positive. And here are just some recent headlines. I mean, Dunkin' Donuts couldn't even get it right because they used their cups, Philadelphia Eagles cups in Boston, right? Not really positive stuff going on for the most part. And this can be really a detriment to our own mental health and to the people we work with. All right, so what do we do about it? I don't know, I just absolutely love these pictures. And so sometimes I think we talk about self-care, work-life balance. It can look really, really difficult, like one move and we're falling off that ball, right? But I like to think, at least for myself, I'd like to be like that second element. It almost looks like she's smiling, right? I'm balancing, I'm having fun and riding through. Civic engagement, I promise I would talk a little bit about self-care. it can replenish us. It connects us to self-efficacy, this idea that we do have a say, we do have some control in our lives. But self-care does necessitate balance. And this can look different at different points in our lives because I recognize we're all balancing different personal and professional obligations and responsibilities. But civic engagement can make us feel like we belong, that we have friendships, that we are associated with people who value similar things that we do. It also really helps to bridge that macro and micro divide that's so often present in our profession. I think if we reframe civic engagement as something other than more work, so we can move from barely balancing it to smiling along the rope. So oftentimes, once we figure out there's all these opportunities for engagement, we have these questions. Do I go to that meeting? Do I volunteer to be the chair of that task group? Should I subscribe to that mailing list when my email is already inundated? Do I join this group, right? We have all these decisions that we need to make. And I guess for me, thinking of how these decisions can be different at different points of our lives. And so I'm going to just wrap up here and we'll answer some questions. But unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. That's Dr. Seuss in the Lorax. And Teddy Roosevelt reminds us to do what we can with what we have and where you are. And so recognizing it's going to look different for all of us at different points in our lives. So just kind of circling back to where we began, we covered a lot of ground in about 45 minutes here. Hopefully you all have a better understanding of the connection, the explicit connection between our code of ethics and our civic responsibility, and ways that we can participate in local, state, and federal elections. Thank you for sharing this time together. If there's any questions, we can definitely have them now.
Yeah, definitely. So as Laurie said, if there's questions, you can go ahead and enter those into the question section. We do have a little bit of time remaining, so we definitely appreciate that. I'll also just mention again, the handout is available, which Laurie said has a lot of extra information in there. So that's under the handout section. You should be able to just download that. And I will also go ahead and post the link to the evaluation in the chat section as well, so you guys can see that. And that's going to be the best, or that's going to be the way that you're going to go about getting your continuing education credit if that's something you're interested in. So I will post that now.
Thanks. And just I'll sneak peek, but here are the references from the slide and also some additional resources, but just a heads up that that's there as well.
Okay, it looks like, so one question here, Laurie, may social workers work for a candidate on their own time?
Yes, yes, and it's been really interesting. I have been engaged, I guess, the past 2 years. Yes, if you're looking to be engaged with someone that NASW Pennsylvania has endorsed, I believe the chapter sent out an email to members. There's a part-time field organizer who can connect you with that. But the skills that we bring are so, so important. I had to laugh when someone was like, I thought social workers only did therapy. Some of the most efficient and productive task groups have been supporting candidates. And I think for me, there was this misnomer that the only way to get involved was to knock on doors. And that's so not true. Becoming a notary, easy to do, you can do it online, and it's very time limited. When candidates need to have petitions circulated to get on the ballot, and they have to turn in campaign finance reports, having a notary is really important. Fundraising, it's actually really easy to throw a party, and people don't want a lot of food, and it's a lot of fun. And so we've done picnics, family-friendly picnics, but throwing a fundraiser for a candidate in your own home can be really helpful as well. Candidates need treasurers, and so keeping track and filling out the campaign finance report. So there's really just so many things to do: phone banking, canvassing, and working the polls. And that's often done through political parties, and social workers can do that in terms of someone has to get those machines ready, and someone needs. We have a judge of elections, a minority and a majority inspector, and a clerk at every single precinct. And so these are the people who go to trainings and ensure that those rights I talked about are followed through.
Yeah, I'll add too. I know you mentioned really quickly the thing about volunteering for NASW-PA. I can speak to that a little bit. So I did put posted a link to our Get Out the Vote 2018 page, where there's an opportunity to actually sign up. And like Laurie said, our field organizer can actually send you a list of names that you can call just to try to like encourage people to vote. And these would be all social workers on our members list. So if you have an interest in, getting out the vote, like encouraging social workers to vote, advancing social work values through political action, this is an awesome way that you could get involved. And it's broken down into really little chunks. I mean, you can volunteer to do, call 30 people, 60 people, or 90 people. And we estimate that like 30 is about an hour. So you could volunteer, it's kind of like micro volunteering, like an hour to 3 hours of your time to just kind of advance the social work profession and kind of encourage people to get out there and vote. So I did like I said, I put the link there in the chat section as well if you're interested in doing that or looking into that further.
Yeah, and I know, Tyler, people who have fun with it, and they, have pizza over, have some friends over, people are there with their cell phones, and they have competitions. How many people do I actually are going to answer the phone when I call? We often leave messages a lot of time, but to do it communally can be a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, very cool. I love that idea.
Yeah.
I did see another question here too. This is interesting. Are there any registration choices in Pennsylvania besides Rep Dem or independent?
Choices on the ballot, there are the Green Party, people running as independents. So there are differences here. Now the laws in terms of how you get on the ballot are different. And so in the primaries, you're only going to see Democrats and Republicans, but then third parties can get on the ballot for the general election.
Awesome. Well, not seeing any other questions at this time. So yeah, like I said, I'll be in touch a little bit later today with everyone who attended. We'll have that link to the evaluation. Make sure you can just do that now if you want to get it out of the way. It's right there in the chat section. And yeah, hopefully, you guys would take away some of the information that Laurie gave us today, and maybe you feel inspired to get involved, to do some volunteering, to encourage other people to vote, and just kind of remember how important that is, especially during this season. It's a great reminder of what we can do if we all kind of do get involved and make sure to, get out the vote, so to speak. So thank you again, Laurie, for coming in and teaching for us today. It was really, really informative.
Thanks. I guess I should mention, Tyler, I didn't put my email address, but folks are always welcome to email me. It's just lauriefr@temple.edu if they have any questions or concerns. So, yep.
Awesome. And I can put that in the email I send out a little bit later today as well, if you'd like.
Great. Sure.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Laurie, for coming in today and helping us kind of understand things a little bit better.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.